let's move on. Let's talk about the nonlinear classifiers then. So our objective is to construct nonlinear models that utilize more complex functions of our input variables, and we want to do so without feature engineering. So the idea that we're going to use is that instead of designing feature maps, hand designing them, we're going to learn them, right? So instead of feature engineering, we're going to do feature learning. We're going to design complex systems made up of, the way that we're going to design these complex systems is that we're going to assume they're made up of a large number of simpler parts. You can imagine a neuron being a simpler part of a much more complicated neural net. We're going to optimize the complex system, and then we're going to go through and see that it's going to involve linear combinations of each of those little parts. Okay, so let's review some complex models. Perhaps the most complex model that we know is our brain. We know of, but we don't know everything about it. And many machine learning models are loosely inspired by the human brain and biology, and I want to emphasize that it's loosely inspired. So if you ever say that anywhere, just say that it's loosely inspired. I mean, there's connections of neurons together, and they help processing from some input to some output. But there's still a lot we don't really know about our brain. So our brain has about 100 billion neurons, 10 to the 11 neurons, each of which communicates on average with 10,000 other neurons. The ways that these communications or these hookups work is that a neuron has two terminals. We have the axons at the end of a neuron, it's called the axon terminals, that then get connected to the next neuron's dendrites. So dendrites can be seen as the inputs going into a neuron. It goes through a nucleus within its cell body. If some conditions are met, neurobiological conditions are met, what happens is that a signal or an impulse is then sent down the length of that neuron or the axon of that neuron. It gets to the terminals of the axons, and then it goes to the next cell. And depending on how these neurons are combined together, then interesting patterns arise from it. But at a fundamental level, that's what a neuron looks like. So the basic computation unit of the brain is a neuron. It consists of dendrites that receive signals from other neurons, the cell body or the soma that then processes those signals. If a threshold is passed, then it spikes, and then it sends a signal down the axon, down to the terminals where the synapse with, or the connection to the next neuron dendrites like this. If you want to learn more, then maybe you can watch this video on your own time. This is from 12 years ago, so the graphics aren't excellent, but gives you the impression of how these connections are connected to one another. So what happens inside a neuron itself? So neurons receive input signals, as we said, inside the soma. You thought this was a course on machine learning, but it's actually neurobiology. I'm joking. It accumulates voltage from all of the inputs that it has, right? We said a neuron can be connected up to, let's say, 10,000 different ones. So there's a lot of signals that are being sent down. Once the signals that are coming into a neuron reach a particular threshold, once the stimulus passes a particular threshold, then a bunch of gates open up and close, and sodium flows in, and then the spike is sent down, and then potassium goes out. A lot of different chemical reactions happen, but ultimately what's happening is that a spike, that's why they call them spiking neurons in the brain. A signal is sent down the axon of that neuron to the next ones, and rinse and repeat at scale. 100 billion neurons, 10,000 connections each. Of course, this is a very rudimentary, high-level overview. So how do we make this, how do we represent this using a mathematical model? That's exactly what McCulloch and Walter Pitts did. Remember the duo that had the big age difference, and they were completely from different fields? They came and said that why don't we define a mathematical model and call it an artificial neuron, which does exactly what we described, which computes a function of the inputs that come into that particular neuron. So artificial neurons, otherwise known as units within a neural net, they perform computations similar to, let's say, a logistic regression function that we saw. What was logistic regression? Logistic regression was W transpose X plus its bias, and then it went through an activation function. And you can see here that that's exactly what's happening. We have different inputs from different neurons come in. They get each multiplied by the weight of the connection. So if they have a lot of connections together, then You can think of the weights being high, and then they get accumulated together inside the cell body, and finally they pass through a function, like a logistic function or whatever activation function you want. And so the output here, the output that we see here, can be represented mathematically as something similar to what we saw for logistic regression. Now, our general ideas, so this is a unit. This is one single computational unit, which we've studied at length, and we said the limitation is that it only works for linear data. If we can throw together lots of these simple neuron-like processing units, the idea is that perhaps then we get some powerful emergent behaviors that can do some powerful computations. And that's what neural nets try to do for us over many successive layers. Now, I want to for a minute go back to the loosely inspired part and tell you that a lot of what we see today in neural net-based machine learning systems is really inspired by and built on decades of research across different fields that all really inspired one another and came together at various points. So we very, very briefly talked about the neurobiology of a system and how spiking neurons happen. And then we had the field of computational neuroscience that abstracted some of those details away and came up with a computational approach to the neuroscience approach. And then finally, we have artificial neural nets within the field of AI and machine learning that builds upon that and once again abstracts things to simpler models to do some complex processing. So yes, we are loosely inspired, but we're very much, distant away from all of the details that go into our physical brains. So how would we implement a neuron in Python, right? We said that neurons compute a function that looks something like this. Y is an activation function of a linear combination of the inputs times the weights, the importance of each of the inputs coming in. If we were to implement it in Python, then we can write something like this. So we have the sum that happens inside the cell body or the soma is just the inner product between our inputs and the weights plus our bias, right? This is X, this is W, or W transpose, and this is our bias, W transpose X plus B. And then finally, what was at the end? There was an activation function that came out, right? And so this line down here corresponds to the activation function that we have.